Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. This podcast is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. Matthew Ho joins us today. We talk about the Afghanistan Papers that were published in the Washington Post at the end of 2019, and about the media treatment of these issues. We discuss Matthew's experience in the military and in foreign service, the war in Afghanistan during the Bush and Obama administrations, and the culture of lying that has developed in the military and has been written about. Matthew resigned in protest in 2009 over the war in Afghanistan. Matthew Ho is a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C. He's a disabled veteran, a former U.S. Marine Corps officer, and a Department of Defense and State Department official. Matthew was in the Iraq War with the Marines and in both Afghanistan and Iraq with the State Department teams. He's on the boards and advisory boards of a number of organizations, including Exposed Facts, Institute for Public Accuracy, and Veterans for Peace. He writes and speaks regularly on the issues of war and peace, and he's appeared on numerous media networks, and his work's been published by a wide array of online and print media. Matthew Ho is here talking to us from North Carolina. Hi, Matthew. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for having me on. This is great.
So I've read about you and I've listened to some of the interviews you've done with Scott Horton, and I'm really glad to have you on to talk about the Afghanistan Papers and Afghanistan in general and the wars and all that. But for people in the audience who haven't met you before, could you just take a few minutes to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, sure. I was in the Marine Corps for 10 years, joined the Marine Corps after college, and this was before 9/11. This was 1998, January of 1998. And I participated in the wars in Iraq, both as a Marine Corps officer and as on a State Department team. And then in 2009, I had a appointment into the Foreign Service, the State Department, and my first post was in Afghanistan. And about 5 months into my time there, and prior to that, of course, like I said, I'd been in Iraq twice, but also too, I'd spent a good amount of time in Washington, D.C., both at the State Department and at the Department of Defense, working on war policy, basically. And so in 2009, when I go to Afghanistan, after 5 months there, I resigned in protest over the escalation of the war by the Obama administration. Basically, I recognized the escalation as being something that was only going to intensify the war, fuel the insurgency, make a corrupt, predatory government larger and more corrupt and more predatory, and just continue the killing, right? I mean, continue this suffering of the Afghan people going on. It began in the late 70s, prior to the Soviet Union's invasion. It began, and so I had gone there with the impression, that the Obama administration was going to do something differently with Afghanistan than the Bush administration had done, or at least what was going to occur is what we had seen happen in those later years of the Iraq War, 07, 08, 09, where we made peace with the people that were fighting us. I mean, that turned out to be a temporary peace, of course, and the hell the Iraqis have gone through has just been continued and continues up until, now. However, when I got to Afghanistan, though, it became quite apparent that the Obama administration was no different than the Bush administration, that they were just going to try and win the war for, U.S. domestic political reasons, so that President Obama could be a better commander-in-chief than Bush was, the Democrats could be better at fighting wars than the Republicans were, and the Pentagon could get a victory, because there was no way anyone was going to say Iraq was going to be a victory, and the Afghan people were going to suffer, and there was no way I could come home to the United States, meet somebody who had lost a son or a daughter or a husband or a wife or a father or mother, brother or sister, whatever, and tell them that it was anyway worth it. as well as, too, like I said, the idea of escalating the war was just going to mean that the war was going to escalate and that there was going to be no way of resolving the conflict. It was just going to make things worse, which, of course, it has. So I resigned in protest in the summer of 2009. I'm sorry, in the fall of 2009. And for the last 10 years, I've been with the Center for International Policy, a think tank in Washington, D.C. I do this kind of work. I speak out against the wars, try and make up for what I took part in. Even when I knew it was wrong, I still kept taking part in it. And so, I've been doing this for a while now. And I appreciate the opportunity to come on your podcast and speak to your listeners and, speak with you as well.
Well, when I saw that Washington Post had launched this project called the Afghanistan Papers, you were the first person I thought of. I was curious to hear your thoughts about the whole project and, what had been released. But also when you first blew the whistle, which I don't know if you call it that or not, but you've got a lot of media attention, right? The climate was different at that point in time. But this time, and I have to admit, I keep the cable news on in the background on mute some of the time, but I don't watch that much media. But I haven't seen the kind of demand for your thoughts on this from the mainstream media that I did back then. Is that the case? Have you been sought out? I've seen you on a lot of independent media. But what happened?
No, that's exactly right.
So
yeah.
These are the Pentagon Papers. What the equivalent of the Pentagon Papers. Why are they not bringing people like you? I mean, I'm not. This is not a real question, right? But what are your thoughts on that?
No, it actually is a real question because and you're exactly right, Joanne. Because 10 years ago, when this happened, the media was different. It was changing at that point, and with the internet and everything else, of course, it was changing. You're seeing a lot more independent journalism, a lot more independent media. YouTube in 2009, YouTube was a couple years old, at least in terms for people who, I'm sure it was created years before that, but in terms of kind of the broader public awareness of it and utility of it, it was only a few years old at that point, YouTube. So the launching of a lot of these independent media operations has really, exploded in the last 10 years. But when this happened, as you said, so when I resigned, when I resigned my position in the State Department, I sent a letter resigning. And what happened was Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, who was the president's special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the time, the letter went to him, and he, agreed with almost all of it, 97% or something like that. He told me he agreed with. He never told me what he disagreed with, but the 3% he didn't. But he, but then he sent it to the president, and he sent it to Hillary Clinton, and a lot of people agreed with me. I mean, that's I think what part and parcel with the Afghan papers is. That's the same with the Pentagon Papers of Vietnam. Is that so many people involved with the war, whether they be military or civilian, recognize the war as being futile. Whether or not they thought it was justified, whether or not they thought it was morally right to do, they saw the war practically as unwinnable, as like an unending conflict, as a mistake. But no one was saying anything. And what happened was I ended up, just as a chance one evening, after I got home from Afghanistan, I was at a bar one night watching Monday Night Football, and the guy sitting next to me was a Washington Post editor, and we got to talking. I told him my story. He said, you should call the foreign. And I told him what I wanted to do was write an op-ed. I wanted to, because I saw in this point, this is now October of 2009, and there's a lot of conversation about the Afghan war, but there's hardly any dissenting opinion. There is so much being left out about it. And I said, hey, I'd just like to write an op-ed, and he said, I think you're better off talking to the foreign policy desk at the Post and have them write an article on you. And I said, okay, whatever. I didn't think that was going to happen. So I called the Post the next day, and A couple hours later, Karen DeYoung, who was a really pretty senior person at the Washington Post, called me back. And a few days later, there was this large story on me, and above the fold, I don't know, 2,500 words or something like that, big story on me. And I remember waking up that day morning that the story came out, and I had 3 TV trucks in front of my house, and
Oh,
I had about that first day. I think I had 75 media requests that I could count. My voicemail got full. My Facebook page exploded. I mean, all kinds of stuff. So really, I had no preparation for this. Fortunately, the woman I was dating at the time worked in public affairs, so
that was
I was
lucky.
very that was very lucky. Otherwise, I don't know. And she helped me. She coached me. She kind of figured out how to do things for me. So that was really helpful because I would have been overwhelmed and just I don't know how I would have handled it if I didn't have Molly there. And so it was a big, and it went on for months, and it actually still hasn't really ended to a degree. But you're right. I was on cable news. I was on nightly news. I was being interviewed in newspapers, and that lasted for a couple of weeks. And it was being effective, and I know it was effective because the United States Central Command, which is the military command responsible for the Middle East, which is based in Florida, at the time was headed by David Petraeus, General Petraeus, and they actually hired a strategic communication firm to discredit me.
Oh my
And it happened. I had lots of interviews that were canceled because of it. I had the journalists that had and producers that had more moxie or gall or guts. They would tell me about it, and I would say that's complete. And what this strategic communications firm was doing was the first thing that they did was they set up a Wikipedia page about me that was full of like lies and half truths and distortions and all kinds of stuff that cast aspersion on my credibility. That I was a person who was making this up. Basically, the story was that I had just gone to Afghanistan in order to quit so that I could become a media celebrity, like something
God. Oh,
crazy. But
really?
yeah, it really was. It was nuts. I actually got to the point with that because I had people who were then trying to correct the Wikipedia page. And finally, I contacted Wikipedia and I had it removed. And yeah, there's no Matthew Ho entry on Wikipedia. And that's from what I understand, it's blocked until I give them the say so. Wikipedia won't put up another page about me because because I requested it to be blocked because I had to deal with that stuff. But anyway, I was on a lot of news. I was on the Today Show, and I was being effective, or the message was effective because the times that the Today Show called me back to have me back on, I then got bumped because the White House put on Joe Biden and then Bob Gates. So I was being effective. And then they hired this firm and everything. But still, I was still getting on, particularly with, say, MSNBC. And that lasted until about the end of 2011. And at that point in 2011, MSNBC made a switch in their programming and how they were doing things. And they'd always kind of been the Democratic version of Fox. But at that point, they said, look, we're just going to open it up and admit it and go with it. And at that point, and CNN had been this way for a little while, and Fox certainly was, unless you represented the Democrats or represented the Republicans, unless you were Team Red or Team Blue, you were not getting on. I mean, and that wasn't just the case for a guy like me talking about Afghanistan. That seemed to be the case for almost everything. And so you see this evolution with the television news around that time in the early part of the last decade, where it really becomes, and MSNBC's ratings increased. I mean, their ratings went up. They did well because of it. But at the same time, if you turn on those channels, as most people know, and I haven't, I mean, I'm speaking kind of from the perspective I have because I haven't had cable news in 5 or 6 years now. But you tend to only get people who are representing one party or the other. And then occasionally, if there is some type of extreme emergency or whatever, they will bring in an expert. But yeah, for the most part, it's just a punching gallery between the two sides, and that's the case, throughout all of, the television media, as well as too with NPR and PBS to a certain extent. If you're not part of kind of established credentialed media or established credentialed, that fits in line with what the supposed experts are saying, then you don't get on.
Yeah.
And what's interesting too is the same, and that's been happening with print media as well, where so the Washington Post runs this huge story on me, again, above the fold, big deal. And then over the last 10 years since that happened, the Washington Post has never published anything I have sent them, whether it be an op-ed or a letter, and they have never asked for my comment that I can recall on any story. So you have this experience. It's not just me. It's men like, say, Danny Davis or Danny Surgeson, both retired Army officers who spoke out against the wars while they were, in the military still. They both lost their careers because of it, basically. Not that they really wanted their careers anymore at that point, but they took on a tremendous risk in doing what they did. Danny Davis actually went to Congress in 2012 with a classified report that he wrote, using all the classified data that basically these Afghan papers have shown to be exactly right. Danny went to Congress in 2012 and said, look, the generals are lying to you, and here's all the information. And nobody responded. I'm sorry, not nobody. A handful of members of Congress actually read what he wrote, but no one acted on it. No one did anything. And so it's just not me. It's a lot of other people who had experience, as well as then too all the people who have been right about these wars all along. They're not being asked to comment. They're not. Say a guy like you brought up Scott Horton before, whose book Fool's Errand is just if you need to start off on something on Afghanistan and understand what happened and why it happened, read Scott's book. But Scott has been right about this stuff for his whole life, basically, but he's been on the air for almost 20 years now, and he doesn't get called on to comment. The Post or the Times or whoever doesn't, ask Scott Horton for his opinion. And Scott has been right about everything, as well as all kind, as what most of the people listening to this have been right about this for decades now. So it's very frustrating. And I think there's a number of reasons for it. I mean, there's, like anything, there's no one reason for anything, but I think there's a few different reasons. One is that when you have establishment entities such as the Pentagon, such as the major media, such as, say, Congress, whatever, they realize that their position as elite is very precarious, and that damage done to one will mean damage done to the other. Yeah. So, right? I mean, but so that's why. So you see that they are very afraid. The major media are very afraid to damage another elite entity to take on. That's why you say along the lines with the idea about healthcare. Why the media is okay about talking about specific instances of issues with healthcare, but the broader healthcare system, they are very loath to take on or address. That's why, when people are talking to, say, Bernie Sanders in the media about his healthcare plans, they say stuff like, why are you going to bankrupt the country with your healthcare plan? It's all this, I mean, they don't talk about the facts of it. They don't ask open-ended questions. They don't treat it fairly. And that's the case, I think, for any elite establishment within this country, is that they realize that if one of the links is broken, there's a possibility that they're all going to break. The other thing, too, with media is that because there's so much more now, because there are so many different methods and varieties of reporting and so many people out there doing it, that the major media is very afraid of losing their access, that they're very afraid of not having the opportunity to speak with the generals, to be in the Pentagon, to go on these VIP tours of Afghanistan or Iraq or, whatever, to get behind the scenes looks at our military bases on South Korea, all those kinds of things that they want for their ratings. They're very afraid of losing their access. And again, this is borne out in other ways too. Many people, if you haven't seen Amy Robach, who is on, I think, ABC on Good Morning America, I think she's on, her leaked, when they were talking about the Jeffrey Epstein case.
Oh, yeah.
A leaked video of her came out where she's talking to her colleagues on the set, and she talks about how years ago she had done an investigation on Epstein and Epstein's relationship to Prince Andrew of the royal family in the United Kingdom. And Amy Robach says that investigation, that report, got shut down by the higher-ups at CBS News because they were afraid of losing access to the royal family.
Royals, yeah.
That's right. If they run this negative, and that's the same way and that's what happened with me when that strategic communications firm on behalf of David Petraeus was bad-mouthing me, discrediting me. That was kind of the bottom line of it, was that, look, if you go and talk with this guy, we're not going to let you speak with our generals. We're not going to let you go on the next VIP trip to Afghanistan. You're going to lose access to us. And they are really afraid of that. And Danny Davis, again, he went through the same thing too. He went through the same, issues with the media, where he was on the front page in the New York Times. He had gone to Congress. Again, he's been proven right about all this stuff. And, absolutely nothing in terms of the media coming to him and asking him. He's done well for himself because he's at a think tank that really pushes him and pitches him. So he does get on Fox News a lot. But for the most part, you don't see many anti-war, anti-imperialism, anti-empire, pro-peace, whatever you want to call these people. You don't see a lot of them on the major networks. And then there are other reasons too that, we could get into. But certainly it's a real issue because you don't have this. You have that. It's maddening because the wars have all been failures. They've all been morally wrong, and there is no connection in the media between them. There is no holistic view of them. Everything in media seems to start as if history starts on the day something happened. So, for instance, with the latest thing with the United States and Iran, it seems as if history starts for the media on the day that Donald Trump had General Soleimani of the, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps assassinated. There's no, everything seems to happen in a vacuum for the media. And with these Afghan papers, which shows that, look, the United States government was systematically lying as a real. This was how it was operating on a lie. It wasn't just coincidence. It wasn't just random. This was the part of the operation itself was to lie. The whole war was a lie, and that goes with Iraq. That goes with Libya, where the British Parliament had an inquiry into Libya, and the British Parliament found that the war in Libya in 2011 was again a systematic lie, that it was just a con job. The war, what has happened in Syria has been shown to be a lie. And this, of course, goes back with Vietnam. It goes back to the Spanish-American War. It goes back to the Mexican-American War. Certainly, the wars against the Native Americans were all proposed on the idea that the Native Americans were committing atrocities against white people. And so for the safety and security of the white race, you had to deal with these savage people, these barbarians, which historians have shown have been, for the most part, lies, that there weren't these atrocities being committed by the Native Americans. The white people were committing most of the atrocities. If anything, the times the white people were killed, it was primarily because, the Native Americans were fighting back against the white people. Yeah, I mean, I remember there was a few years ago, I read a thing about how the number of settlers that were killed in a 50-year span going from the east to the west, by covered wagon and wagon train, that were killed by Native Americans, numbered in the low 300s over 50 years or something. Yeah. So all those, but we grew up on, these Western movies of, the cavalry coming to the rescue of the besieged wagon train that was, had to go into a circle, to defend itself from these Native Americans that were right. I mean, that was all. No, that was all. But at that time, too, in the 19th century, there was this sensationalism in journalism as well. That's never quit. So as the newspapers in New York or in Boston, Philadelphia, wherever, in order to get readership, scandal, or war are always the two best ways, right, to attract readership. So you had these tales of what the Native Americans were, how they were massacring white settlers. And it turns out that most of those tales were not true, that they were made up or they were grossly exaggerated. But I was thinking about, yes, go ahead.
So basically, building up the enemy, you have to justify the, to get people to go fight, you got to get lots of money to go fight for expansionist causes. And you're right. It goes back, I mean, probably definitely way before even the things that happened in this country. And
oh yeah,
it's just, but so we did, you did have good coverage. That must have been a politically convenient for somebody.
It was, yeah.
Or we had a better media at the time, even though even at that point it wasn't great. But I can't help but think about that when I see these Afghanistan papers being released now, and by the Washington Post, which is at the same time really trying to sell a war with Iran overall. At least their editorial people seem to be. So, I mean, is there any, and do you have any thoughts, or do you know anything about like why they were released now, or do why this sort of break from the sort of ban on anything negative about the wars in our media?
Like a lot of people, said, I wasn't shocked about what was released in the, in the Afghan papers. I was shocked that the Washington Post released them, because it is, as you just said, Joanne, it's so counter to how the Post has been for, the last however many decades. It used to be called during the Cold War. It was called Pravda. If I'm remembering the name right, Pravda on the Potomac, mocking kind of the right, like Pravda was the main state newspaper of the Soviet Union, and it just repeated the talking points of the government, and that's what the Washington Post has done for at least since the end of the Second World War, if not before. So it was surprising that the Post did do this. I don't know why they did it. I would, what strikes me is that they did a 3-year legal battle for it, because they must have found out that these interviews, these thousands of pages of interviews, I think 400, I think 600, I can't remember, 600 or 400 off the top of my head, people were included in interviews, but 400 of them said negative things or contradicted the official story of the U.S. government on the Afghan war. And that's what they were pulling from. But they had to submit a Freedom of Information Act request to get these interviews. The government denied it. The U.S. government denied it. The Department of Defense denied it. And then they went to court, and they spent 3 years in court trying to get these things, and they were ultimately successful. So that's a lot of money, and that's a lot of effort. That's a lot, particularly for a newspaper that has been so pliant and so obsequious and so going along to get along with the U.S. government with these wars. I don't know. Maybe this is their angle to try and get a Pulitzer. That
credibility.
And maybe. Yeah, maybe it's a personal thing. Maybe the staff that were involved with this, the writer, the reporters, and the editors who were involved in this project, maybe they were just upset and basically annoyed that they were being denied, and so they went after it, kind of like a dog with a bone.
Yeah.
So maybe it was just simply it's a personal reason, personal issues, but I don't really know, because it's so out of character. But what's not out of character is how you saw it would hardly be commented on, hardly be discussed, that outside of independent journalism, outside of media like yourself, there has been very little interest in these stories. and how quickly, as you brought up, the Post publishes this big thing. I think it came out December 10th. Within weeks, within weeks, the Post is editorially, on board with going to war with Iran. Maybe not. They camouflage it because they have to assuage their readers' hatred of Donald Trump. So they put the certain language in there about how Trump is, being too aggressive or being, not very careful in his actions. But you get through that covering, and you see that the Post is happy to go to war, of course, with Iran. And that's just a mere weeks after they published this huge expose on how the U.S. government lied for years about Afghanistan, just again like it lied about Iraq, about Libya, about Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. It's the outlier is these papers, and it's hard to understand why they did it, and that's why my mind goes to accusing them of reasons of wanting to win a Pulitzer, or just because they were annoyed they couldn't get it, or whatever, as opposed because they have not been doing adversarial journalism at all. They have occasionally publish stories from time to time that show the fraud, waste, abuse of the military. They do publish stories from time to time showing that the war is going badly. But their commentary in those stories is almost always supportive of the war effort. They certainly aren't calling on people who are critical of the wars. And so many times they write, they publish the words coming from anonymous, unnamed, sources within the U.S. government. I mean, they do that over and over again. And of course, they're happy to run with any classified intelligence that is given to them by the State Department, by the Department of Defense, by the National Security Council, by the CIA, whatever, that further advances the agenda of the U.S. government. So it really is it is very odd that they published this. I'm glad they did, but it's because it's so out of character for them. But happily we have it. But it's been ignored. You asked me when we first started talking before you started recording. I think you said something like, "I hope you're not getting too tired about talking about the Afghan papers." And the reality is that very few people have asked me about it. Very few people have interviewed me about it. Certainly mainstream media, there's been no contact at all, and the same thing, and in independent media, the usual suspects have, the Real News and people like that have reached out to me, Counterpunch and things like that, but not, not anything that, certainly not CBS News or BBC or CNN or the New York Times or the USA Today or anything like that. It's been, and the papers have been really pushed aside. The fairness and accuracy in reporting, the guys and gals there who do such great work. I know a few weeks ago they kind of did an analysis, and they found that some outlets, some major media, like NBC News, for instance, hadn't reported on them at all, while
that's amazing,
right? While other organizations, and off the top of my head, I can't remember which, but if you go and look back at what FAIR said, they reported on it once, so like the day or two after the Post story came out, CNN might have put up a thing about it, might have mentioned it on their news, but that was it. No follow-up, certainly no, and then of course Congress has done, I know the House Foreign Affairs Committee held a hearing where they had one witness, the same guy who comes in multiple times a year, John Sopko, who is the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, who has been very critical of the war, who has been really good in a lot of ways on this. But he also comes to testify to Congress a couple times a year. And that's the only witness the House Foreign Affairs Committee had come in to talk about these papers. I mean, these are things that where you have uniformed Army officers, colonels, saying things like every data point was deliberately, and I'm going to paraphrase here, every data point in our reports were deliberately altered to give the idea of progress or success. I mean, so you have senior U.S. Army officers, senior U.S. military officials admitting that it was programmatic, it was deliberate altering of doctoring of the numbers that were given to Congress about the war, the data, the reports, et cetera, were all fabricated, were all misconstrued, were all altered in order to lie about the war. And Congress has done nothing.
Like,
absolutely nothing. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. And yeah.
In a sane world, that should have launched major public hearings at the very least, because a lot of them, if not all of them, are still alive. They can bring them right in. We spend more than $1 trillion a year when you count everything up. The war continues. The peace talks are falling through. I mean, I can actually think, I can speculate, and I suspect that over time it'll become clear why they did this. For example, there have been proposals to privatize the operations in Afghanistan. So someone who had a proposal to privatize everything could use something like this, or they could want to do a clean slate and say, okay, yeah, all this happened, now we've got a new plan. They could roll out a new plan, or it could be another way to damage Trump, or I don't know. They always seem to be looking for something like that. I don't see how this could hurt him that much, but although I guess it could hurt his opponents. But yeah, I mean, I think we will realize in time why this happened. But the focus is back on Iran, and well, let me just move on a little bit here. Let me just look at my questions here. I had, of course, a million questions for you.
Yeah. It's amazing, though. I mean, it really is like as I said before, it's not like this is like the one war where they lied about. That it's not like this is the outlier. It's not like, oh wow, but they were so truthful about Libya and Iraq and Syria and everything else, right?
Yeah,
it's you're right. I mean, like yeah, and then it's absolutely. But I guess it's probably always been this way, I mean, so.
What do they say? The first casualty in every war is the truth, or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So there were a couple things. I didn't read the whole thing. I had picked out a couple of things that were of interest to me, and Scott Horton, he was in Washington, and I actually went down because my son's down there to visit him, and I went to see his talk.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and he brought up he brought up a lot of things. He basically, I guess his overall argument, I don't want to boil it down too much, but I thought the point of his whole argument was that this war really never even had to be fought. And but in that, he brought up an interview with General Flynn, who said something like, nobody ever asks why. Nobody ever asks why we're in Afghanistan. It's like they talk about the what we should do and the when and the how and how much it'll cost, but like nobody ever asks why. And that was one of his big critiques. So that was one point that I was interested in. And then the Washington Post also did an article titled, it was about opium. Darn it, now I lost it. It's something like we're overwhelmed by opium, and they told the whole story about how the Taliban actually eradicated, basically on command for the farmers to stop, and that all changed when we came in there, and the production surged and all that, but they frame it in such a way that, we just couldn't get our act together, and one part of the bureaucracy couldn't agree with the other, and the British were in charge of it for a while, and then the military didn't want anything to do with it, and I mean, all these excuses.
If we had just done it better, it would have worked out well.
And I have no trouble believing that bureaucracy, I've worked for big companies, been part of big organizations, no trouble believing that bureaucracies stumble all over itself sometimes, but it just was the same excuse so many times. I just really was not buying it. I really wasn't buying it. So those were two things that stuck out to me, but I was curious, were there any particular things in there that really stood out for you?
Well, I think uh, the points about how it was deliberate, the lying, and how that really just kind of got shrugged off.
Yeah.
That I mean, the idea that you had and not even talking about all the Afghans being killed, but that you had all these young Americans being killed over there, and the lies, and the fact that politicians, there are a couple politicians that sent out tweets, Kristen Gillibrand and Blumenthal from Connecticut and a few others. They sent out tweets saying this is outrageous. We need to get to the bottom of this, and they of course have done nothing since, as far as I know. But the people who were lied to themselves, Barack Obama, Joe Biden. I'm not going to talk about the Republicans because that's a completely lost, that's just a waste of breath. But
Mm.
those who were lied to for the escalation of the war and for the worst parts of the war, uh, they have been quiet, and this is something that was recognized. So when I resigned, and I had to go see Chuck Hagel, and at that point, Chuck Hagel, along with David Boren, former senator from uh, 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 Oklahoma, Hagel and Boren were the co-chairs of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. And Hagel had me come in, and I had a series of incredible conversations with him, and really got to know him well, I feel like, and really felt like he'd become a friend almost. And I thought this was a guy who was going to do the right thing, who was one of the few good people in Washington, D.C. And he was at that point teaching at Georgetown as well. And he had brought me in because he said, I want to know why the stuff that I hear from these Army officers and Marine Corps officers in my class that you're also saying here in the Washington Post, and you're telling me now, how come that information is not what the president is hearing? And Hagel recognized that, yeah, the president was being lied to about this. And so, but then when Hagel becomes Secretary of Defense, I thought, my God, there's going to be maybe this is really going to be a change. Maybe something really might happen here. And nope, same things occurred. Libya occurred, Syria occurred. That he went along with. He pushed back against it, and ultimately he resigned. But like he didn't do anything to really try and stop it. So I think what really struck out to me was just the mechanics of it, the fact that this is just the way it goes. You brought up the how the same excuses are used over and over in these papers. Well, the problem is we only had people in Afghanistan for 1 year at a time, and then they go home, so they never really learn about the country. If we just had it, if we just had focused on this earlier, or if you see the military saying if the development people had done their job better, you see the development people saying if the military people had done their job
Yeah,
better.
yeah.
It's a lot of and then, like as you brought up, people blaming the bureaucracy, which, as you said, is true. I mean, hey, I had a friend of mine. She went to go work at the Department of Energy, and she had never been in the federal government before. And she said to me, "My God, I never understood what bureaucracy actually was." She said, "I knew the definition of it. I had an idea of it, but I had no idea that it actually meant that you can see the answer right in front of you, but there is no way to get to it. That you
Yeah.
cannot." Right? I mean, like here's what we need to do, and there's so many levels, and that's the reality of bureaucracy. But that's not the reason why the war was futile, or the war was never going to be won, or certainly wasn't a reason why the war was morally unjust, and that injustice fueled the people who were fighting against us. And then you also brought up, Joanne, what General Flynn had said, who had been director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, had been in charge of intelligence in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and had famously Donald Trump's first national security advisor. And, I think that lasted a few weeks. And I'm not sure what's happening with his legal issues right now. But what he did say, as you brought up, was that the why of these wars, no one ever asked the why. And that's certainly the case. You just had, men and women going over there and not thinking about what they were doing, just taking on the mission without any idea as to the reasons behind it. And, you see that as well, too. You see that in the papers, in these Afghan papers, this not questioning why we were there, admitting that the lying was occurring, admitting that we didn't know what we were doing, but kind of just this unwavering idea that we should be there, or that we have a reason to be there. It also stood out in the papers to me as well, too, is that most of the, unfortunately, and I don't know, I haven't seen recently, maybe they have gotten it and the Post is still working on this, but most of the 400 people that the Post pulls interviews from these papers, most of them are anonymous. And I think 90% of them are anonymous, because I think they only had names for about 40 people. And those 40 people, the Post contacted. And from what I recall, reading through those people's responses back to the Post, all but one basically said, that's not what I said, or that you're not interpreting it right, or, and so they still go on with the lying. They still go on with the defense of their career. None of them, with the exception of one, and I'll get to him in a minute, none of them are willing to double down, and say, that's right, I said that, the war was effed up, it was unwinnable, we didn't know what we were doing there, we were lying about it. They all say, and, which is crazy, because the Post literally has the documents where these people said that. Or they say, well, the person who was transcribing it wasn't transcribing it accurately, which, you know what, every time I've done something like that, they give you the opportunity to review what you said
and
to make sure it was correct. Yeah, exactly. That because they want to get it right.
Yeah.
And they are paraphrasing. It's not transcription. They are paraphrasing. But every time I've been a part of something like that, for the most part, you see, you have the opportunity to ask to see for it, and they almost always give it to you, or they send it to you before they finalize it. Certainly, when I did these kind of interviews with the Special Inspector General for Iraq reconstruction, these lessons learned, I was, they sent them to me after they completed it. And then I said, yeah, that's what I said. Or I said, no, that's, it was 40, not 100, or whatever, corrected something. And then they sent me the final copy, so there's no reason. So these people, with the exception of one, are just continuing to lie, because that's the system that they thrive in. That's the system they live in. That's what, otherwise, if they don't keep lying, they're going to lose their jobs. They're going to lose their houses. Their kids aren't going to go to college, as well as, too, there's a culture of lying that exists within the whole national security establishment. But I'll bring up the Army just because I have it at the top of my head. Both West Point and a professor at West Point just wrote a whole book about this, about the culture of lying and deceit at West Point, about how West Point is just producing these basically craven officers who know how to play the game for their own betterment, who know how to advance and know what to do to advance through the Army, because that's what they've been taught at West Point. And that's the building blocks now of the officer corps of the Army, as well as several years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago at this time, the Army War College in Pennsylvania, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, they put out a whole big study talking about the culture of lying in the United States Army, about how lying was common in the U.S. Army, that's how you got ahead, was you lied. That you never told bad information. You never said things weren't going right. You said what was necessary to show progress or success, and then you were promoted. I mean, so you have very serious work showing that there is a culture of lying, let alone all the anecdotal information we have, let alone the fact that these wars were all built on lies. All the wars were built on lies and sustained through lies. And all the generals, hey, look, when Trump went and spoke to the nation a few weeks ago about killing Soleimani in Iraq, all those generals filed in there, and they all stood, and none of them blinked, and they all listened to Trump, and they all supported him, and that was the same with Obama. That was the same with Bush. These men and almost all men at that level, some women or lower ranking generals, but almost all men at the senior levels, they go along with the lies, so that's the culture, and the one exception to the these people saying, no, I didn't say that, continuing with the lies, was Barney Ruben. And Barney Ruben has been at, I can't remember if it's Columbia or NYU for years, and he is he's an expert on Afghanistan, and he worked with Richard Holbrooke, and that's how I got to know him. He has been saying this for years, that what we're doing there is wrong. We don't even know why we're there. The reasons for it are wrong. That what we're doing is just making the war worse. And so when the Post contacted him, Barney, to his credit, said, yeah, it's exactly what I said, and I've been saying it for years, and on and on. And so that's what stood out to me, was the continued lying that occurred. How only one person that the Post asked about it actually responded back and said, yes, that's what I said, and I meant it. The rest all gave excuses or continued lying or tried to say that the transcripts weren't correct. And so that stood out for me as well. And again, the media has barely spoken about this, and Congress has done nothing. You have an Army colonel who says, and there are other points in this, but this just stands out for me, who says every data point was deliberately altered to, give the image of success or whatever, he said. And you're saying basically that the U.S. military has been lying about these wars, falsifying information given to Congress about the wars, thousands of dead Americans, tens of thousands of wounded, hundreds of thousands with PTSD and traumatic brain injury, and the Congress is doing nothing about it. They're not hauling people in and saying what happened. And it's just. And the other thing that stood out, too, about these papers, and Sopko said this, the one person Congress did bring in, again, John Sopko, the Special Inspector General for African Reconstruction, he said, it said in the papers, it says it in somewhere in the Washington Post stories, it says this as well. And then Sopko said it again to Congress at the Foreign Affairs Committee hearing he was in a week or two ago. He said that basically, this is for when we do it again, when we do this the next time. So there is also, too, that stands out for me, is that this was lessons learned for the next time. This wasn't a chronology of what we did badly. This wasn't any attempt to be a mea culpa. This was what can we learn from this experience so when we do the next war, we won't repeat his mistakes. That's the purpose of it. And that's something I think that's been lost out as well, is that this is just not a historical recounting of the war in Afghanistan. This is preparation for the next war, wherever it may be, Iran or back in Iraq or, what have you. And yeah, it at that point, I think, hasn't been spoken about. I know a few people caught on to it. I think David Swanson spoke about this and some other folks, but for the most part, that's been left out, is that the purpose of these interviews, are not to write, the history of the war, but are to prepare for the next war. And that's something that people have to keep in mind, is that the whole system is set up that way. You brought up, Joanne, at $1 trillion a year, and that's what our national – it's more than that. I think it's $1 trillion. According to Bill Hartung, who's a colleague of mine at the Center for International Policy, it's $1.2 trillion a year. That, right? I mean, so that we spend on our military and our, in quotes, national security, right, and intelligence. And for people like me, disabled veterans like me, you're going to be paying for my stuff for the rest of your lives, and I have to go to the hospital once a week. You guys are paying a lot of money for me, right? And then all the other guys and gals. So there's so much, and then the interest on all this, which is only going to get worse, because at some point interest rates will go up. I was just listening to a guy on Scott Horton's show talking about this the other day, so the interest on this, we're spending, according to National Priority Project and War Resisters League, we're paying about $150 $140 billion a year, I think, in interest payments on debt service for past military spending. I mean, when you break that out, that makes just the debt that we're servicing, the interest payments on past wars and past military spending, that makes that like the third or fourth largest a line item in our federal discretionary budget. It's crazy. And it's all about lies. And it's going to grow. It can only grow,
Yep.
It can only grow. Yeah. So it's amazing, because then the other thing about this is, just as you have these Afghan papers come out, and as you have men in there's, I think, one woman left two women left in the Democratic primary. And then Tulsi Gabbard's still hanging in there, but they're never going to let her back in the debate, particularly after she called Hillary Clinton queen of the warmongers. There's no way, right? There's no way they are letting her anywhere near a microphone anymore in front of a national audience. So the other thing that comes out of this, when you look at the larger picture of these papers, is that, okay, we question all these other items that we have. We can't build better roads or better bridges. We can't have a universal healthcare system. We can't help, let alone have free college. We can't help people who are struggling with debt. We can't help people who are underwater with their mortgages. All these different things that would help the majority of Americans, the vast majority of Americans, we can't do because we don't have enough money. But then we spend all this money on the defense budget, on the intelligence budget, on veterans, on homeland security, et cetera, $1.2 trillion a year. And it's all based on lies. And there's no blinking about it. There's no questioning about it. And it bothers me. I haven't watched the debates much, but at this point, it's not brought up. I mean, it has been brought up at times. It has been said at times. Sanders has said much better things about it in the last 6 months, about looking at the defense budget as a way to fund other things. But he's still not great. And his record hasn't been. He's been good. He's voted against it a few times, but he's also done a lot of other things in terms of his votes that, okay, is this how he really feels, or is he just posturing to kind of lean into trying to get certain voters? But yeah, I mean, it's really maddening that these wars that are all underlined and sustained by lies, they're unquestioned, and they continue to go on, and new ones seem to come up, and the justifications for new ones are always the same lies, or at least they're not questioned, that preceded the ones before. So the whole thing is very maddening. But I'm glad those papers are out there, but in itself, though, it's a difficult experience to go through, particularly as, say, the war in Afghanistan. The last couple of years, various groups have deemed it the most violent war in the world, since the Syrian war has quieted down a bit. Although if you're living in Idlib, that's certainly not something you want to hear, right? But at least for the rest of the folks there, and they're coming home as, and everything. But, even compared to Yemen, the war in Afghanistan is more violent. And it's just the people continue to suffer. And, here in the United States, even though the evidence of the war as a failure, the war as the war as being nothing but lies, the war as being meaningless, worthless, etc., is put literally right in front of everybody, we all just move on to the next thing. And I use we in the grander sense. I know everyone listening is on board, but yeah.
Yeah, I think you hit the root of it. It's the lies. And I'm glad that you brought up the books and the people talking about the culture of lies, which that's a whole nother subject we could get into, especially because, like, at West Point, they're so well known for their honor code and all of that. But it looks like that's a facade. And
lying in the sense of, like, I think their honor code is it's so out of date that PowerPoint slides and Excel spreadsheets and, writing a paper on your computer doesn't count for the honor code, because the honor code goes back 200 some odd years or whatever, right? I mean, so all this newer stuff, the way the Army actually operates now, they're able to avoid. But it's all one great big lie, because you have this honor code, and the honor code itself is a lie, because as you know, as has been documented, they're teaching, and as you see, and it's just been one after another of these military officers of all branches who go into Afghanistan, who go into Iraq, who go to, take part with the war in Yemen, et cetera, and they just go along with it. They just subsume themselves to the lie and go along with it and don't question it, and just wait for their next assignment so they don't have to take part in it any longer. Yeah.
And if you don't, because they were raised in a culture of lies, if you don't, you'll fail. So they're basically taught. Right. They're taught to that's how you succeed.
That's right.
I'll just wrap up with, I just do want to mention that Katrina Vanden Heuvel Washington Post did publish an op-ed, and just one little bit of it in which she mentions you, and she mentions Danny Sherson. So she does, credit you guys, which I was glad to see. But she said, she starts right out, the lies had brutal consequence. Since 2001, more than 775,000 troops deployed to Afghanistan. More than 2,300 died there. 20,589 were wounded in action and still counting. More than 100,000 Afghan civilians and security forces have been killed. The war has cost the United States more than $1 trillion. I'm going to guess that all of those numbers are underestimated. But, she did get to the root of it, and you're getting to the root of it. And this is not a sustainable situation. As I feel like, Matthew, I feel like everybody knows that. I feel like almost every American knows this. So I don't think anybody knows how to fix it, because it is such a massive structural problem that it's not going to be easy to fix. But, I guess we're doing a little bit that we can by being honest about it as best we can. And you're sharing your knowledge and experience. And I really appreciate that. And I hope we can continue this conversation. And any time that you have any subject, in terms of media exposure, this is an open invitation, open door. You can always come on this podcast. And I really love talking to you. And please let people know how to find your work and how to follow your work and how to support you.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, and I'm happy to come on anytime. So please just reach out to me. Happy to talk about.
I will, definitely will.
Yeah, I have. So you can look me up on Facebook. And then, of course, if you Google, I'm trying not to use the word Google. I'm trying to use search engine.
Yeah, me too.
Right. I mean, I call but anyway, yeah, if you look me up on the internet, I have a website, MatthewHo.com. I update that once a month, probably put some interviews and some writings up. And then my most recent writings, the last 4 or 5 I've done, have all been on Counterpunch, and also too on antiwar.com. And that's where you'll find, most of my stuff there on Counterpunch or Antiwar. I also want to give a plug for antiwar.com. The way people ask me, how do you keep on top of stuff? And it's hard, is that I get the antiwar.com daily news brief every day that a guy named Jason Ditz does. And that is, very, very helpful to me. And so if anyone out there is looking for some type of source or some type of way to keep on top of things with all these wars, antiwar.com and Jason Ditz does a very good job of doing that. But, I appreciate you having me on. And, I know this is a big issue. It gets into, certainly we can get into all kinds of larger aspects of this. As we were talking about the lies, what does it say about us as a society that we just walk alongside these lies that are killing, that have killed millions of people, that made tens of millions of people suffer and homeless and psychologically traumatized, that have just everywhere from Libya east to Pakistan has been devastated. I was born in 1973. and actually south now, because what we did in Libya is now affecting so much of sub-Saharan Africa,
Yeah.
like Mali, not Niger, and Nigeria has had issues for decades. And I mean, like, you mean so Africa and the Middle East has just been torn apart by U.S. military policy. Um, and we just walk along with those lies. And at some point, someone has to make the connection to the fact that we walk alongside the lies about the inequality in this country, although that's spoken about a lot more than lies about the war, I feel, but the inequality in this country. And also, too, how does that translate into all our violence? I mean, is it a coincidence that we lie about that we have these wars overseas, but we also have more guns in this country than we do people, that we have the largest prison system in the world? Is that all a coincidence? I don't think so. So at some point, we have to really make these connections to the lies abroad and the lies at home. The organization I belong to, Veterans for Peace, that's one of our things is wars abroad are mirrored in the wars at home. And without peace abroad, we'll not have peace at home, and vice versa. Without peace at home, we'll never have peace abroad. So at some point, we have to make these connections. But yeah, no, I mean, thank you for having me on and for, letting me talk about this.
Yeah, and I'll just say that Martin Luther King, I mean, he recognized that and voiced it really well. Some of the things that you're talking about right there, the connections between all of them. So, in his Beyond Vietnam War speech, particularly.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that opened my eyes. He is one of the factors in what helped me understand this. But again, I don't want to keep you too long, and I appreciate it. And we'll talk again soon, I hope.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joanne. I really appreciate it.
Me too. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Matthew Ho. Follow Matthew on Facebook. Find his recent writings at Counterpunch, antiwar.com, and on his website, matthewho.com. Around the Empire podcast is independent media, and your support's really important. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. The podcast can be found in many places, lots of ways to listen to it, on any mobile podcast app or on the website, aroundtheempire.com, on Patreon, or on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Follow on Twitter @AroundTheEmpire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.